Good afternoon. It's good to see such an audience on the final session of the meeting. For some of you, it's been quite a long week, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk about toxicology and risk science. And as Jerry has said, you're going to see a significant overlap with the previous topic, which is not unreasonable, given the relevance of risk sciences to foods and water safety. Let's try and figure this out. So toxicology and risk science, as you know, is one of the 4 thematic areas that have been proposed under the One ILSI strategy. And ILSI's actual first work was in the area of toxicology and the risk of food ingredients. And since then, our research and translation of science into practical tools has expanded to many areas of risk science: food and water, pharmaceuticals and consumer products, industrial chemicals, environmental, and human health. And of course, the extent to which this is done varies markedly throughout the organization. Some branches are much more involved in these activities than others. But that's not to say that, of course, toxicology and risk science isn't necessary worldwide. And I think that's one of the lessons of the One ILSI strategy, that we need to think about the dissemination and propagation of the science in the risk assessment to every part of the world. Because we've already heard in other parts of this meeting how important it is that things like risk assessment, best practice and expertise is developed, so that there's an ability to harmonize the food safety and environmental safety standards. And some of the areas are listed here. I'm not going to go into them in any detail, and I should stress that throughout this talk, of course, like any talk, it's been strongly influenced by my own personal experience, and my experience has been largely with ILSI Europe and HESI, although those are 2 of the branches that have been most involved with risk assessment, along with the Research Foundation. And on the next 2 slides, which are very busy, there's a list of selected publications in the area of chemical risk assessment, which have been published directly as a consequence of support by ILSI entities. And I don't expect you to go into look at these in detail, but I just highlighted in red the specific topics: alternative models for carcinogenicity testing. This was on the transgenic mouse models that were being promoted in the late 90s, and the idea that they would replace normal wild-type animals in the assessment of carcinogenicity, and there was a real need for basic information about the performance of those models, and ILSI HESI undertook a big project on that. The threshold of toxicological concern, which you've heard about already, was pioneered by ILSI Europe in a series of publications, and 2 of the key ones are listed here. This study from one of a whole series from something called FOSSI, I can't even remember what it stands for, it's Food Safety Research. It was an EU collaborative funded project coordinated by ILSI Europe, and it was about laying down a framework for the totality of the risk assessment of chemicals and in food and food ingredients. And this is a sort of overarching paper that actually was one of the earliest and seminal publications laying out in detail the concept of problem formulation in risk assessment, and is still cited for that purpose. Papers on risk assessment of compounds that are genotoxic and carcinogenic, 2 papers here. These are really about the use of the margin of exposure as an alternative to linear low-dose extrapolation for prioritizing and communicating the risk of compounds with no threshold, or presumed to have no threshold in the dose response. And these are genotoxic carcinogens in this case. Work on the mode of action by the Research Science Institute, the predecessor of the Research Foundation, on the human relevance of mode of action, and then subsequently on the key events dose response framework, looking at dose response and thresholds. And these had a really profound influence on how risk assessment was done to use a weighted evidence approach in determining the implications of findings in experimental animals to humans. The agricultural chemical safety assessment activity of HESI, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. This is one of a series of papers published by that group. And then one of a series of papers on the qualification of biomarkers. This was for renal toxicity. This actually was one of the very first submissions to the Food and Drug Administration that led to the qualification of a series of biomarkers for use in preclinical safety assessment of drugs, in this case for renal effects in animals, rats. And then this final one is on low-dose synergy, and a review that was undertaken by HESI and addresses part of the whole problematic area of chemical mixtures. Up to this point in time, various international, regional and international organizations like EFSA and the WHO had been working on a framework for the assessment of combined exposure to chemicals, and had said that there probably isn't a concern about synergistic effects at low levels of exposure. But there actually was no definitive review of that at that time, and so as part of its efforts, HESI undertook to commission a review on this, and it essentially showed there's little or no evidence of synergy at human relevant exposures of these chemicals. So one of the things I wanted to highlight here is that the diversity of topics, the fact that they bridge everything from really substantial laboratory-based efforts to computer simulations to desk-based reviews. The fact that they've had a profound influence, much of this work, on standard setting, guideline setting, the way that companies do business to try to produce safer products more efficiently. This is clearly a translational science at its best. And the other minor incidental point I'd like to raise is that the authorship of these papers reflects some of the best scientists in the field and is a testimony to the ability of ILSI's entities to attract the involvement and engagement of scientists throughout all the sectors. There are government scientists, academic scientists, and industrial scientists here, all of whom are well recognized and highly respected in their fields. So I've mentioned this already. ILSI's mode of operation is very varied. It varies for the project, it varies by the branch. Some branches really don't commission actual lab-based research. Other branches will do this if necessary and appropriate and have the funding. And so we have collaborative research programs which can be both laboratory and desk-based. We have workshops, conferences, and expert panels, reviews and white papers, the development and analysis of databases, development of guidelines, dissemination of information through many different routes, including journals and other publications. But because of the importance of risk assessment or risk sciences to other than the academic community, if you like, it's been recognized for some time that dissemination simply through published peer-reviewed literature is not enough. It won't always get to the right people. And we've been seeking and pursuing alternative avenues as well, although of course publication is of paramount importance, and the pooling of financial resources. And I've shown you through that list of publications that we do indeed conduct research using all of these modalities. So just as a case study with some pluses and minuses, I wanted to show you the Agricultural Chemical Safety Assessment Project of ILSI HESI, completed a few years ago now, which integrates testing and targets endpoints that will be used for risk assessments. In other words, instead of just looking at everything, look at those endpoints which are going to have the most impact on the risk assessment of agrochemicals. It avoids the generation of data that are not relevant for that particular risk assessment need. And it contributes to the reduction and refinement in the use of animals, which, although wasn't the primary or overwhelming objective, is an important secondary consequence, partly because of the regulatory requirements in many parts of the world now to reduce animal use in toxicity testing to the extent possible. It promotes a dialogue and study relevance and reverses the trend for guideline proliferation, just adding another guideline to all the ones that already exist. So this was the first comprehensive effort to redesign the testing framework for pesticides used by the majority of national and supra-regional authorities. We'd been using the same general framework for up 50 years, and this was the first time that people sat down and said, let's just start with a clean sheet of paper, but recognizing the realities, the pragmatic realities of trying to get something onto the market. In other words, it was too early to completely do away with all animal testing, but what can we do better? And we came up with these series of 3 or 4 papers with a number of significant proposals. One of them was, for example, to replace the multi-generation or 2-generation study of reproductive toxicity with an extended 1-generation model. This was very readily accepted by the scientific community, but even more importantly by the regulatory community. And in fact, it was the ILSI publication that was the basis of the OECD revised guideline for the testing of reproductive toxicity. And it's been cited and widely influential in the data requirements and guidelines of many agencies testing agricultural chemicals, the EPA, EFSA in Europe, GMPR, the OECD. So it's a precedent-setting potential in harmonizing data requirements and moving towards a more science-based approach. That's the good thing, but the bad thing is that we're beginning to see a reversal of this progress. We're beginning to see that in some areas they're not accepting some of these proposals, despite the fact that there are OECD test guidelines, and many major agencies have said this is the way to go. And I think also that we're beginning to see, driven by the blogosphere and the chemophobia of some organizations that was discussed in the last presentation, influencing politicians and policymakers so that they are now beginning to talk about very draconian data requirements for the testing of these chemicals. We're not sure where we're going to end up, for example, in the issue of endocrine disruption in Europe. It's already been a hotly debated issue in the US, and it will not go away. And it's driven largely by, or driven extensively by, a non-scientific debate. And so one of the themes is we can do a lot of good science, but at the end of the day, we're the victims of public pressure, or we're subjects of public pressure, because the politicians react to public pressure. So there's been global change in the risk assessment landscape in the last few years. We all talk about the paradigm shift in toxicology in the 21st century, and some of these are listed here. High throughput technologies, high content analysis, computational toxicology, systems biology, and bioinformatics. They used to say the meek will inherit the earth. They now say the bioinformatician will inherit the earth, because the vast amounts of information that we can now generate defy the average scientist to analyze. It needs a highly specialized individual, and there's a whole new discipline emerging, which is going to be really necessary. And we're going to have to be able to talk to these people, because we cannot divorce those analyses from biology. So toxicologist understands biology, the bioinformatician understands the data, and we have to get them to talk together. The US EPA's ToxCast program just a couple of weeks ago released information on 1,800 chemicals tested in 700 different assays at multiple concentrations. That is and that data has not been analyzed for implications yet. In fact, there's a challenge out for people to look at the data and tell them what it means. That's a sort of example of the big data sets. We're living in the era of what they call big data. Genomics and epigenetics, we've now got the methylome to add to the genome and the proteome and the metabolome. In other words, the methylation statuses of DNA. We've got I don't know if there's a acetylome of the histones, because we now know that the histone acetylation is essentially a code. It's not a random process or a blanket process. It's very specific. There's the issue of cumulative risk, combined exposures. We really need to get to grips with that. People have tried to, EFSA has published their pesticide group have published a recommendation that we should group chemicals based on toxicological endpoint, because we don't really understand enough about mode of action, and maybe that's not even appropriate. And what you end up with is several hundred chemicals in the same grouping, where you're going to analyze their combined exposure for risk. Now, for one thing, that is incredibly resource intensive. It's incredibly conservative, and that is before you start to add in any other chemicals outside the agrochemical sector. And of course, combined exposures don't understand commercial boundaries. In other words, you are exposed to the multiplicity of chemicals in the environment, not to the multiplicity of chemicals that are used as pesticides or is used as cosmetics or is used as industrial chemicals. It's the combined exposures. We're beginning to see a whole range of issues which we weren't we didn't have to tackle before. The new technologies, biofuels, for example. These are just some simple examples. The whole issue of biofuels and the range of risk assessment issues that's going to throw up. Nanotechnology, we're all aware of the way that we've had to wrestle with this issue over the last few years as to what are the implications for human health, environmental impact, if any. And of course, indirect consequences which need the input of risk sciences, which, for example, climate change, which will impact on us in many, many different ways, not just through changing the pattern of crops, but also things like flooding, which will lead to the redistribution of contaminants, if you think about it. I mean, we had an exercise in the UK where all the advisory committees were asked to advise the government, what's the possible impact of flooding and climate change on what you do as a risk assessment committee? And so we sat down and thought, well, you know, if you have a flood and it washes out all the dioxins or the asbestos sitting in a warehouse somewhere and disperses it throughout the community, you've got a big risk assessment problem on your hands. And finding solutions to the issues of these, and these are issues of international importance. They're not, they don't know national boundaries. Will require the input of talented individuals conducting integrated multidisciplinary research. And of course, that's the other big buzzword today, multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, where we need the input of a variety of different scientific and even non-scientific disciplines to address the problems that we're facing. So the challenges to ILSI are we have to capitalize more on the global reach of our organization, which is really, really impressive. Earlier today, somebody pointed out that there are things that would be impossible for any other organization to do because they don't have the tripartite global capacity that ILSI has. But we don't capitalize on enough, clearly. We need greater collaboration between the entities, both to benefit from the expertise and to provide solutions where they're most needed. We need to improve multi-stakeholder and multi-sector interactions, and we need to work with external organizations, and we have to recognize that this will not necessarily always lead to ILSI taking the lead position, but we should ensure that ILSI's contribution is appropriately recognized. And against this background, there is one initiative which we need to think about getting really involved with throughout the entire organization, although we are involved to some extent, as you'll see in a minute. And that's the WHO Risk Assessment Network. This is a really small baby. It was launched in July 2013 in Seoul at the International Conference of Toxicology. And its mission is to improve chemical risk assessment globally through fostering and facilitating sustainable interaction between institutions on chemical risk assessment issues and activities. And many of you in this room would say, well, hang on a minute, that's just a sub-paragraph of the ILSI mission. You can see how well aligned we are as an organization in what we're trying to do in risk assessment and indeed in food safety and this mission of the Risk Assessment Network of WHO. And the objectives of the network are actually quite ambitious. They're ambitious with no money. No, always a bad combination. Provide a forum for scientific and technical exchange, facilitate and contribute to capacity building, and we've heard many times at this meeting, and most recently the last presenter, the real importance of capacity building and training. Promote best practices and encourage harmonization of methodologies. As I say, that we have, ILSI, some countries and some organizations have developed really sophisticated science-based approaches to risk assessment. We need to disseminate them more. Assist in the identification of research needs and promote the application of new science and risk assessment practice. I should say right now, the network is not going to be a research organization. It's not going to be about identifying research projects and finding funding for them, but it's going to at least identify gaps which could be filled by research. For example, the European Horizon 2020 program, which is just launching now, is a multi-billion euro program, and obviously if the network had been running for 2 years, we could have fed into the actual program there, and hopefully we will feed into the next iteration. Assist in the identification of emerging risks to human health from chemicals. This is something that ILSI could actually play a really big role in. Share information about work programs to avoid duplication, and on request assist WHO in development of training and other materials to support the above. How are we doing? A couple of minutes? Yeah. It's global in scope. All WHO regions and all economic strata are encouraged to participate. It comprises participations from institutions, which are very broad. The only thing, they can't be companies, but they can be professional societies and NGOs in official relations. You'll notice that's what an area of ILSI currently falls into. Other non-profit entities with relevant expertise. And it's recognized that not all participants are going to come up with dollars. They could contribute in many different ways. They could be dollars, and that would be very welcome, but it could be in-kind support to projects. It could be technical expertise and advice or sharing of information. The network is shown here. What was done was to set up a steering group, and that's now been converted into the network coordinating group with the launch of the network. We rolled into the network. I keep saying we because I'm on the steering group and now on the network coordinating group. We rolled into it a number of ongoing activities. So the EHC, Environmental Health Criteria documents, which are really well-respected series of publications from WHO on risk assessment activities and methodology are part of this. The mode of action group that had already been running was rolled into it, and a training database was initiated. The establishment of a training base was initiated as part of that. Some other activities are the early life stages exposures, uncertainties and hazard characterization, and some other ongoing activities like the chemical safety cards and the CICADs, the concise international chemical assessment documents. So the training database was an early initiative. It's ongoing. It was idea was to develop an online database to provide access to information throughout the world regarding human health chemical risk assessment training courses, because there's a real problem in identifying where is an appropriate training course in my region. And it will allow searching in a variety of ways, and it will include a variety of topics. It will include relevant information on who you should contact. And it's not going to be a hugely complex database. It will provide the key information you need. And in November 2013, ILSI has finalized a collaborative agreement with the World Health Organization to jointly develop and maintain this database. It would be freely accessible to everybody for chemical risk assessment training courses. And we have staff in HESI who are taking the lead to do this now. WHO will provide regular input and guidance on the overall database project activities, but HESI, on behalf of ILSI, will provide financial and in-kind support for development and implementation of this collaborative resource. And I'm delighted to say that the ILSI PIP this morning agreed to make a contribution to help in the development of this database as well for this coming year. Oh, I don't know, let's talk about mode of action. So the WHO network and ILSI, I think, provides real opportunity to utilize ILSI's involvement in risk assessment, and the fact that ILSI is a partner, ILSI as an entity is a partner in the network now, that's been agreed, and HESI is a collaborative entity in developing the database, will allow coordination between the branches of ILSI and the regional offices of WHO, as well as WHO Central in Geneva, in helping promote the ambitions of the network, which of course is to improve risk assessment worldwide.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Alan. Alan did a great job of setting me up for an easy discussion here. I think it's very clear from his presentation that there is no dearth of issues to work on for ILSI in the risk assessment arena, and the challenge then really becomes what don't you work on, and how do you hone that focus so that we're using ILSI's resources most optimally. So I guess really it becomes a matter of leverage for the organization. We think about this one ILSI strategy and how it works going forward. So how do we optimize the diverse expertise networks that we have across the organization, the fact that we have a regional branch structure as well as some branches that are global in scope. So they have different capabilities, different strengths, and different opportunities to contribute to the risk science issue as well as all of the other global issue areas under discussion. And the key here is really how do we leverage these in terms of enhancing the quality, the efficiency, the scale with which ILSI addresses these issues, and then at the end of the day, how do we enhance ILSI's ability to impact the science and for the benefit of public health. There's a delay here. So we, as was said earlier, mentioned by Eric Henches, we had an opportunity as branch staff on Friday for a good portion of the day to talk across the branches, the branch leadership, about what's going on in our respective arenas with regard, in this case, to the risk science issue. We kind of set aside toxicology in a first step to focus a little bit primarily on risk science as a common area. And we recognize that before we really begin defining how we externally focus our efforts as an organization, we could probably do more to internally understand what the capabilities are that we have currently and how we can grow those and enhance those for the optimal external output. So at this Friday branch staff meeting, we started some of these discussions around who is doing what internally within the organization. How can we then use those capabilities to enhance the capacity of ourselves as ILSI professionals, as Jerry has coined that term, as well as the volunteer leadership and resources that participate within the branches. And then ultimately use that enhanced capacity within the branches to think about how we build a more sustainable cross-branch program that fulfills the One ILSI vision. So when we think about what some of those cross-cutting needs are, both organizational, meaning internally across the different ILSI branches, and then externally, again, and Eric pointed this out as well, and I think it's true in all of these topics, that capacity building is a term that keeps coming up. I think to us that means extending knowledge, sharing knowledge and resources to help fulfill our mission. So this is something that we need to probably think about both within the individual branches and then how the branches can help the public health community at large enhance their ability to fulfill their mission of improved public health. We talked about opportunities here for education and training. Again, these could be education and training at the staff and organizational volunteer level, as well as external outreach to share that expertise in terms of training, workshop, and materials. And then clearly there seem to be opportunities to share experts and expertise in the risk science arena. So whether they are academicians who can talk about current best practices, whether they're industry experts or regulators or foundations talking about the application of this science, there seem to be a number of common themes with regard to both cross-cutting needs and opportunities. Excuse me. So how do we begin to turn the crank on this? I think in my 14 almost years with the ILSI organization, if I've learned nothing else, it's that if you start with a diffuse focus for your program, you're going to end up with very diffuse results and outcomes that have minimal impact. So we clearly needed some kind of organizing construct to build cohesion for our efforts and to define a focal point. And Alan teed this up very well, that the WHO Global Risk Assessment Network could well serve as a really strong organizing principle, maybe not an exclusive focus for ILSI's efforts in the risk assessment under a one ILSI strategy, but certainly as a kernel that could help to focus and define the interactions that we have across the branches. So Alan has gone through a lot of this already, that the network was formed in July, and as he said, the mission is an easy overlay to ILSI's mission and objectives, which makes it a really nice, comfortable fit for us in terms of thinking about working within that context as part of the One ILSI strategy. As he said, we have the great first step that ILSI is already a member of the network officially. One of the HESI staff, Michelle Embry, is the designated point of contact, but she is the designated point of contact for ILSI as a whole. And WHO made that very clear that that was how they wanted ILSI to engage, was through one contact. They didn't want applications from lots of branches. They wanted the opportunity to work with ILSI as a global entity. So Alan touched on some of these, but I think it's important to consider the potential benefits here, both in terms of what this discussion forum could bring to the risk assessment network and what the network could bring back to ILSI as an organization as well. With regard to WHO, the ILSI's global network could certainly help assist in capacity building activities, issue identification, infrastructure and contacts through our regional offices and global programs around the world, and thought leadership in terms of risk assessment techniques and methodologies. We also obviously bring potentially resources, expert and management and coordination strengths, which are something that WHO has often come to ILSI for in the past. In terms of what that network participation or a forum focused on risk assessment could bring back to One ILSI, it clearly could bring a direct line of communication with this WHO network and all of the partners around the world, from regulatory agencies, academic institutes, other organizations who participate in the network. It also provides a ready line of, we hope it will, it's still kind of getting up and running, but we hope that it will also provide ILSI with an awareness of what are the global issues identified in other fora that are being raised to the network that we can then feed back to ILSI and consider are these things that we can and should be taking on. It offers the potential for new alliances and new partners as we explore interactions with those who are involved in the network. And importantly, we think it provides a common ground and focus for discussion across the branches. So those discussions may focus on the risk assessment network, but in all likelihood, if successful, those discussions could also span into other areas where ILSI as a collaborative community might address risk assessment issues. So I guess the final two pieces here are about putting the pieces together and how do we do that. And there's no doubt that the science needs are there, the public health needs are there. I think the challenge that we have as an organization, both as staff and as members and leaders, is how we put together both the resource piece and the commitment piece. Because dollars alone cannot drive an initiative that would involve this many people and this much coordination and scale. It also is going to require commitment from staff, from boards, from leaders across the organization to be part of this and to really make it work. That said, if we're able to put those two pieces together successfully, we think there's a lot of opportunity. We could envision an intra-branch web forum or conference call series where we have opportunities for this discussion. We could engage in outreach directly to branches to identify where the risk assessment network could be helpful. And it would provide a forum for information and ideas from the ILSI branches to be shared back to the WHO network through our point of contact. And I think, so final slide. As I said, I think the potential here is quite real and potentially quite powerful. At the same time, there's a really essential need for leadership on this, for resourcing and commitment, and those all are, I think, on equal par. Without all three of those, it will be difficult to move this forward effectively. But if we can bring those to bear in an equitable and common way, then we have the potential for a real positive impact as an organization on global risk science. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.